Welcome, dear friends of the Kreisky Forum. I am very happy that I have a very special guest who I schlepped from London for you here tonight. When her book came out, you see it here, this is the American version, this is the German version, this is the English version. And when I saw this in the bookshop in January actually, in London, We Are Free to Change the World, Hannah Arendt's Lessons in Love and Disobedience. She had me at the title. I thought the combination of love and disobedience is something that I think should really be explored and deeper explored. And so I was very happy that I got this free lecture in a book form. And I thought we should invite her to bring her here. And in that sense, welcome, Lyndsey Stonebridge. Thank you. Not only I thought that this book is very special, but it got immediately very good reviews. And it was also already sold beforehand to the German publisher, for example, and other publishers, because people have understood that Hannah Arendt's teachings are not from another century and buried there somewhere as very clever but not topical anymore. And when Lyndsey Stonebridge looked at the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and then she looked at the bestseller lists and she saw that Hannah Arendt was back with the Origins of Totalitarianism. It was quite clear that there is a lot of Hannah Arendt's writing and thinking that speaks to people today. And this is, of course, now we have Trump too, and he's even more unleashed than he ever was. So we want to discuss this a little bit. Lyndsey Stonebridge, she's a professor of Humanities and Human Rights at the University of Birmingham. It's a very good university in England, in the north. She also wrote other books than this. She's the author of Placeless People, Writing, Rights, and Refugees, another sort of very close of the Hannah Arendt subjects. She wrote The Judicial Imagination, Writing After Nuremberg, which won the British Academy Rosemary Crawshay Prize, Crawshay Prize for English Literature, and the essay collection Writing and Writing, Literature in the Age of Human Rights. She's also a regular media commentator and broadcaster, and she lives in London. So, Lyndsey, if we look at this combination of love and disobedience, what's love got to do with it? Why did you choose it?
Love is at the beginning of everything, and hopefully the end. I just want to thank you for your hospitality. I said to my husband earlier, there'll be 5 people here. There'll be a woman and her dog. It's so close to Christmas, and it's cold. So I'm really grateful that you turned up, and thank you for hosting this conversation. Thank you for hosting it in English as well. It would be a very short conversation if it was in
Otherwise.
German. What's love got to do with it? I hadn't realized when I started this book that I was going to write about the significance of love to Hannah Arendt and to her thought. I thought I was going to write a very different book. It was always the really tough Arendt that attracted me as a student and a postgrad and a young academic. So it was the Arendt who went to see Eichmann and laughed in his face. Or it was the Arendt, I think her last film, her last interview was with a French journalist, and she's wearing this bright yellow dress and suit, and she's smoking, and she says, "I'll have nothing to do with it, raison d'etat." You know, she's just like, I loved that Arendt. And I liked her toughness and her directness. And I hadn't realized until recently how much love had to do with her work. And so when I started this book, my publisher and agent wanted me to call it Thinking Like Hannah Arendt. Anyone who's read Hannah Arendt will know you can't call a book about Hannah Arendt Thinking Like Hannah Arendt, because she would be sitting there saying, "Have I taught you nothing? You think for yourself. You don't think like anyone else. This is the whole point." So we ummed and ahed around the title. And when I reread the book, I realized it was about love and disobedience. And the simple thing is, if you love the world, you have to have the courage to preserve it and keep it and take it. And that kind of is her message. But it started, I'm always telling this to political scientists who have their own version of Hannah Arendt. Forgive me if there are political scientists in the room. I'm sure we have very good versions of Hannah Arendt. To remind them that even though she said, I'm not a philosopher, she didn't like systems building. She was a thinker, she was a phenomenologist. So she begins with her experience of the world. So that is where love starts for her. And it came, I mean, there's two sides to this. One is her intellectual history, and the other is her biographical history. Her intellectual history, as some of you will know, she was taught, not only taught by Martin Heidegger, she had an affair with Martin Heidegger, the kind of one of the forefathers of existentialism. When she was a student in Marburg, she was 18. He was, I think, 38. The significant thing about Martin Heidegger for her is he taught her how to think. This was the beginning of existentialism. This was intoxicating to her generation of students, young starvelings, she called them. We had nothing. We had just bourgeois Europe and no hope. And what Martin Heidegger taught her was that existence is passionate, existence is everything. All the rules have been turned up. The metaphysical ground has been pulled from your feet, but what you have is thinking and existence. And the moment of clarity that provided was extraordinary. I always describe this to my students as being like the Wall-E Coyote moment of philosophy. You know Wall-E Coyote, the cartoon wolf? He's always running off cliffs, and he keeps on running, and he looks below him, and there's nothing there. That's existentialism. But the difference is, rather than suddenly going, oh, and then falling, he realizes the beauty of the pines below him and the snowy peaks, and that running on air is all you've got, but that is beautiful. Mm. The difference, when she finally ended her affair with Heidegger, although how far it ended is a disputed matter, she went to work with Karl Jaspers on Augustine. And Heidegger's whole sort of shtick was like, the only thing we know for certain is we are going to die. That's what conditions are being. So existence is, we're being towards death, and this is what it means to be in time. His big magnum opus was called Being in Time. Being in time is the one thing you do know, said Martin Heidegger, is you're going to die. That book has the word love in it once, which is why Karl Jaspers said it was a deeply unlovable book. Hannah Arendt, early 20s, mid-20s, sits down to write her thesis on Augustine, discovers something else. She says, it's not death, it's love, because the other thing we know is we come from nowhere. That's the miracle of beginning. We all know this. This is the great mystery. Augustine says, that love is beginning. We come from nothing. And what made that nothing, whether it's in Christian theology or whether it's in romantic relationships, is love. We come from love, not death. That's the other fact. So what if love is the kind of, she calls it the pre-political condition of our being? So that's the kind of, setting. That's the setting, but then in her life, she was a really good lover. She was a passionate friend because she knew what it was like to be ostracized, decitizenized, to be a refugee, to be stateless. So she knew what it was like when all you've got is the human condition. And in several points in her writing, she'll say, when you absolutely have nothing, you have one thing, you have love.
If you're lucky.
If you're lucky.
But I, of course, also read this in the political context, as she did too, and you do too. And, when we were thinking, for example, of the name for this lecture talk program that you are in here now, it's called Philoxenia, which means basically Gastfreundschaft, to invite strangers into your place and to exchange, to understand. And I think this is what she understood in the question of being able to enjoy the pleasure in the human otherness, to engage with the others, because that, of course, does not only make political activism much more pleasurable if you are not alone, so that the group carries you, but also that it legitimizes also your own being there, because you have the response from other people. So without having a group effort, which is based also on a mutual understanding, it doesn't work as well. Is that, did I
Yeah, I mean,
that
that's why, I mean, she has a kind of, she's fiercely anti-ideological. So anything to do with masses or movements or constructed groups or even political parties, she was very suspicious of, because she thought that was putting ideas in the way of experience. So in some ways, she'd say you can't have politics without love, and the being in concert with others, she calls it. And I love the idea of being in concert, because when you're in a concert, if you're in an orchestra, not everyone plays the same tune or the same instrument. There's difference built into that. And that's what it's kind of what she says. As you said, it's the pleasure of engaging with otherness. But you're also totally always confronted with the reality of other human beings and their thoughts, which are always difficult as well as lovely. And it's the reality of that she really wanted to affirm. So she's a kind of dissident reader of Augustine. I mean, she loves the statement that Augustine makes, which is "Volo ut sis," I want you to be. Actually, Augustine never said it. Heidegger made it up and put it in a love letter to her. And he said, it's like, I feel towards you, Hannah, like Augustine said, I just want you to be. And it's such a lovely statement. Who wouldn't want to be loved just for who they were? And whereas you know that quite often you're loved for a fantasy of what you might be, or then you fail and fail again, and that also is the joy of love. Maybe a bit later on. So he didn't say it. He used the same chat-up line to another lover about 18 months later, another Jewish woman. So yeah, but she loved that statement for the simplicity of, I just want you to be. It's no, I don't want you to be anything. I want you to be present. And that was, so far as she, that was an ethic for her. So there's that side of it. There's the other side that, she was always against tyrants. And that's why she believed in acting in concert, the joy of acting in concert. And the importance, the thing she loved about politics was the capacity of politics, and she had, her model was the Greeks, for people to be seen, to be able to be performed for a side of themselves that they might not know about, or that they, isn't the same as you have at home, to perform with others, to act. She thought it was one of the most human things you could do. She always thought it was tremendous fun. So she was very supportive of student activists in the late 60s and early 70s.
Which also was fun.
And you just have as much fun as you possibly can. This is fun. This is life-affirming. It's not death.
Flower power. I'm still upset that I was born too late for that.
I know. We got the 80s, which was slightly different.
We got sort of... But, the idea that to understand also how you behave in a totalitarian system, which she sort of was very much aware of, although she fortunately could escape from Germany. This is something which, of course, has a lot, plays back till today, how you behave in a totalitarian system, how you react to it. And I think if we think of her whole relationship, I don't want to call it a relationship, but the way she looked at Eichmann at this trial in Jerusalem, and people getting really upset about till today, because they misunderstand, I think, a little bit what she meant when she talked about the banality of evil. Because one thing that also comes back to her debate about love and about putting yourself in other people's shoes and walk with them is that he couldn't do that. And that she was so shocked about this.
Yeah. I mean, there are several things going on there. I mean, when she... Okay, trying to break this down.
Yeah.
start with banality of evil, then we'll come back to what may or may not have been in Eichmann's head and what we can learn about it. She started off borrowing from Kant with the idea of radical evil. So Arendt escaped from Berlin in 1933. She was working for the German Zionist organization, collecting anti-Semitic material from the Prussian State Library, which was demonstrating that anti-Semitism was, not only, in the headline news, but it was in teachers' unions, it was in educational policy, it was everywhere, and she was caught. Luckily, she was caught by someone who'd only just been promoted in the Gestapo, and he didn't really know, he wasn't quite practiced in finding a conspiracy every time he found a Jewish person. He was rather captured with her, and he got her out, and she came to Paris. When later, and she escaped eventually to America, when she looked at the Nuremberg trials, she just said, I can't bear to watch this because what the Nazis have done has exploded the limits of moral and legal reason. We don't have the tools to address evil on this level. And what she meant by evil on the level was two things really. One is an ideology that treated human beings as superfluous. So this wasn't just sort of, collateral damage, or wasn't just persecution. It was an ideology based on the fact that human beings were superfluous. And the other thing that she thought had pulled the ground from under everything, and I think she was right about this, that this was, through the delusions of omnipotence of one or two men. So we have created this monstrosity of, what she called the corpse factories, but she found similarities in the gulags and Stalin's camps as well. And she said, I don't think we'll ever get out of it, she said to Karl Jaspers. They're just beyond everything. And Karl Jaspers, her teacher, said to her, this is in 1946, Hannah, just be careful. Don't give them the satanic streak of greatness that they crave. Don't buy into this. This is what they want. You have to look at these things in their prosaic triviality, their banality. She never forgot that. So when she went to Jerusalem in 1963, she said, I'm going to have to look at this. I mean, Eichmann and her are 7 months apart, so they have kind of parallel lives. And quite often, when I talk about it in the book, they're kind of almost in the same town, or they're, he was responsible for the clear out of the camp that she was in. There's all sorts of connections. And she looked up, and what she found was not someone who was performing evil, partly because Eichmann was very good at performing all sorts of things, and he had decided he might get off if he performed the role of being a dutiful bureaucrat. That was a sham. This was him doing that. But what she said was this man who just didn't connect with where he was or what he was doing. He was sitting there in Jerusalem, the Jewish state, talking to Jewish people, many of whom were survivors, who knew quite well who he was and what he had done, saying things like, I really don't know how it happened. Not a clue. And she's saying, this man is radically thoughtless. It's not radical evil, it's radical thoughtlessness. It's shallow. And she said it's like, it's like talking to a brick wall. And it's that kind of thoughtlessness that she thought characterized modern evil. On the one hand, evil is always contingent on the ways in which human beings have to be evil to one another. So if you have mass bureaucracies, you have a system whereby industrialists and those bureaucracies and the army are coming together to produce corpse factories, you find a new way to be evil. If you have the mass bureaucracy of, statelessness and citizenization, you find a new way of being evil. I think it's Christopher Browning in his great book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, points out that one of the reasons that the camps went into operation is actual German soldiers did not want, some German soldiers did not want to get their hands dirty, did not want to do the killing themselves. This is kind of like bureaucratized administrative massacre. That's new. That was one side of the banality of evil. But the other was what happens when you have a situation where people are just not connecting with what they're doing. She says he simply didn't think about what he was doing. And she compares him at some point to other villains. If you look at literature, if you look at all the way from Milton, Goethe, Shakespeare, why villains are compelling is because they have conversations with themselves. My favourite is Richard III, Shakespeare's Richard III, who has all the best soliloquies in Shakespeare. And they're all about, at the beginning, Richard's saying, shall I prove myself a villain? And he goes, oh, no. And he goes, oh, yeah, all right. And then towards the end, you have that wonderful soliloquy. It says, is there a murderer here? Oh, yeah, that's me. But he's having the conversation. So in some ways, it's kind of better to be killed by Richard III, who at least thought about what he was doing and then decided to kill you. Although, rather than this person whose evil was banal because he didn't actually think about what he was doing. And he didn't think about what he was doing because he could not hear his own voice in his head. He could not put himself in the position of another. And Arendt says, and she takes this from Socrates, that's what thinking is. I mean, her idea of thinking was not hyper-rationality or thinking stuff through or reason. It was the ordinary thinking that we all do all the time, the two-in-one conversation we have in our head all the time. And she said, you need one thing for that to happen. You need education. You need to really protect the institutions that nurture that kind of thinking. You need solitude. And what totalitarianism does is stop that kind of thinking. It programs thinking. It thinks for you in advance. It's like AI before AI.
Yeah, exactly. And polarization before polarization.
Exactly.
But it's also, still there's this element always where you think, why does it work to block away empathy for the other side? And I mean, the outrage about Eichmann sitting in this trial in Jerusalem and saying, I tried to lower the numbers of people being squeezed in these trains on the way to the concentration camps. And
he said that. He said, I'm a humanitarian.
Yes.
He's describing how he put people on the trains to the concentration camps. He also says at one point, I can't stand the sight of blood. You do have to understand. You're thinking... and she says the other thing that really drove her mad, he said, there's one thing I really regret. And it's actually here. He said, in Vienna, I slapped the face of one of the Jewish leaders. I lost my temper. I should never have done that. And Hannah Arendt says, excuse me, there were worse things happening to Jewish people when you were slapping that guy in Vienna. I mean, this is like,
I mean, it's outrageous, and it's still inexplicable to a certain extent, even if we understand that people who are, being part of a murderous bureaucracy stop also empathizing and sympathizing because it is just also too difficult to bear. Yeah. But it's still, so the question if he still just played a role, I think, will be forever.
Yeah. I mean, I tend to think she was wrong about Eichmann. I think, for myself, I think he was a committed Nazi and he wanted to hurt Jewish people. But I think she's right about the thesis. And I think it's sort of like probably wrong guy, right thesis. Because it not only, because what she says again and again is we've let something in the culture and it's not going to go away. And that's what she was upset about the Eichmann trial, is we haven't addressed what this means. And she said what we really need to understand is crimes against humanity, which is it's a 20th century crime. Why is it a 20th century crime? Because of the thing I was talking about earlier, is we have new ways of killing people. And it was the first time, crimes against humanity was a new crime in Nuremberg. It was the first time that was on the books. It proved quite difficult to prosecute for various reasons. But it's the crime when you eliminate people simply for who they are, not because of what they've done or what they've got, or part of a war, or for strategic reasons, but simply for who they are. And so she would call the Shoah a crime against humanity committed on the body of the Jewish people. Not, of course it was one more crime, an anti-Semitic crime, of course it was, but she said there's something different going on here. And once you let that into the culture, you're not going to be able to put that genie back in the box. And I think events have proven that she was right.
We had Philip Sands here in this program also talking about his book East West Street, where he explains, he also has this very, very, very nice blurb for you here. Exhilarating, brilliant, and utterly original, he says. And he was, his whole book is about this question, how the crimes against humanity and the term genocide came out of this experience of the Shoah, of the Holocaust. And the interesting thing is that this development that we've seen from the 40s on about humanitarian law and international law addressing these issues. I mean, this is one of your core subjects also, aside from Hannah Arendt, in your teaching and in your studies. And I wonder if it makes you, because the thing with this book is that you read Hannah Arendt, but you of course read also Lyndsey Stonebridge, and this very interesting relationship that you have with Hannah Arendt, where you criticize her also, and some things have also changed over these decades, because we of course grew up in this world where we thought that the rule of international law is the normal in the places where we were born, and that suddenly now is changing. I mean, how do you deal with that from that perspective? Do you feel that Hannah Arendt, that we sort of have left an era behind us because we are now in one where we cannot be sure that our institutions will actually hold up?
Yeah, I mean, I do, and I think that she said in the Origins of Totalitarianism, as she was finishing that book, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights was being published and written. Quite often photographs of Hannah Arendt are confused with photographs of Eleanor Roosevelt because they look very similar from that time. And she said the thing that was demonstrated by totalitarianism was that human rights don't work. She says, there's a brilliantly disturbing sentence, is the world found nothing sacred in the abstract nakedness of merely being human, which is to say, the world found nothing that was worth protecting about people who had nothing. And she took the idea of statelessness as the indication. She always said, if you start decitizenizing people, if you strip their citizenship, you are on the way to something really, really nasty. Because once you take away, I mean, she writes about this herself in a beautiful, very distressing essay called We Refugees, and she says you lose your nation, you lose your speech, you lose your habits of thought, you lose your friends, you lose your political rights, you lose your judicial rights, every right is stripped. When you are only human, it turns out you have nothing. There's nothing about human rights that's going to protect you. Then she says, when you listen to stateless people and refugees or survivors, none of them are really saying, I want human rights. What they're saying is, I want a visa, or I want a right to asylum, or I want to go home. I want a home. I want somewhere where I can vote, where I can be seen, where I can be part of the argument. She referred to this as having the right to have rights. She didn't think rights were things you should bestow upon people who you thought were less fortunate than yourselves. She thought rights were always there to be contested, always there to be argued about. That's why what we all need is the right to have rights. So she was always very sceptical that the human rights framework could hold politics, international politics together. And I think you're right. I think the shock of our generation was that happened. I was saying to you earlier, I mean, people tend to think that Arendt became popular when Trump got in. I think Arendt's been a very good companion to the 21st century. I mean, when I wrote Judicial Imagination, which was a book about how people wrote about war crime trials, happened to be a lot of women who wrote about war crime trials because the other journalists were still in the front or sent to more glamorous things. And that's when I was reading Eichmann in Jerusalem, and that was after 9/11 and the Gulf War. This is the Second Iraq War. And two things happened there. One is we had the return of terror. I know you've written about this. So ideologies of terror. Samantha Powers, Obama's former UN person, wrote the introduction to Origins of Totalitarianism and said, look, we have ISIS and Al-Qaeda, we have the return of terror and ideology, absolutist ideology. She was quite right about that. But what you also had was a return of political lying. My country lied about the reasons for going to war in Iraq. We had the dodgy dossier, Weapons Against Mass Destruction. And as Philippe Sands pointed out in his first book, Lawless World, the US and the UK, I mean, not Europe, but then Europe let them get away with it, also decided they were going to turn their back on international law. And it's that point that we had statements like, which I'm sure I found as shocking as you and many people in this room. You had people who actually were supposed to be for human rights, who remain nameless, writing op-eds saying, is this the time for torture? And it turned out the answer to that question was yes.
Yeah.
So for me, it was not Trump is sort of like a symptom of a whole set of things that have been pulsating through the 21st century. But for me, that happened, that's when the kind of the illusion began to crumble.
Yeah, and of course we looked from Europe to the United States, especially as the ones who saved us from the National Socialist period, and then it turns out that, you know, decades later, already from the Vietnam War on, became questionable if they're always right. But now we have reached with Trump sort of a moment where you cannot be sure that internally also, not only in international politics, but also internally, that human rights or that civil rights are being sort of the normal state, because he's starting already now to say, like, he's changing the law of citizenship, taking away that if you're born in America, you get, he's saying that he's deporting millions of people who have a life in the United States. Our government does this here too, by the way, but it's sort of, you know, it's something where I wonder how much this shift is going. But to bring it back to the book also, that's the point where disobedience within a democratic system suddenly becomes a very, very urgent matter. And the question if one should be disobedient within the law.
Yeah. Yeah, and Arendt has very interesting and important things to say about that. I mean, Hitler, of course, said in Mein Kampf, I think it's in Mein Kampf, rights are what is right for the German people, which is to say, rights and the law mean nothing unless they're working for an ideology of vicious nationalism. And you can see that is what's happening again. But it also goes back to the question of what we want laws for. When Arendt went to the US, she kind of fell in love with it. She saw the US as somewhere that would work things out, partly because she said, you can go to the US and you don't have to assimilate, because the concept of American citizenship isn't on the basis of race or ethnicity. It's only made on the contract you make with the Constitution. And okay, so that Constitution is old, but her other thing, I mean, her Constitution worship, she was, you know, she had a kind of a very sexy version of constitutionalism, if I may say that. But the Constitution had to be kind of restated with every generation. That's what she loved about the Civil Rights Movement, because it was making sure that the 14th Amendment would be acted on. So it was like a check. You know, it was civil action in order for the law to do what it's supposed to do. And by the end of her life, she thought America might go the same way as Europe, which is to say, you know, the trashing of law, trashing the spirit of the law, and the trashing of what constitutions can do that nation states recovering from empires and everything that Europe is based on can't do. I mean, she was worried about that quite early, because with McCarthy, the McCarthy trial, she said, oh, yeah, finally I get to America, it looks great. And then literally, you know, a couple of years later, they're checking their passports and saying, you know, she argued that citizenship should be a constitutional right. No one should be allowed to have their citizenship taken away, because that was back on the books.
Yeah.
But there are two things, though. I mean, this is when she wrote her great essay on civil disobedience towards the end of her life. She did believe in civil disobedience, but not in a sense of in order to trash everything, in order to bring the law back into politics, which is to say back to the people. So unlike Thoreau, she didn't believe, and he believed that every citizen has a personal responsibility to act against the law if they think it's immoral. she said, that's immoral. You can't just have one person or a small group of people just saying, well, I don't like that, because that's not how law works, right? We have the law because we need to have something that keeps us, bounded and within the rules that allow us to have freedom. And without some kind of law or rules, there would be no freedom. But she said, collectively, you do need to do that. And that, I think, is why she supported civil disobedience. First was the civil rights movement, which was actually doing nothing less than insisting the 14th Amendment on race be put into actuality. That was that debate. And again, with Pentagon and certainly Watergate, when the law was being abused, when politicians were not acting in correspondence with the law. So her idea of civil disobedience is about, okay, what happens when the law is being trashed? You have to bring the law back to politics.
To honor it.
Yeah, to honor it.
But it starts with the thinking itself. So this is one clear Arendt thing, that she says independent thinking is the first defense against tyranny. Yeah. So that's, of course, with her life history, obvious where that comes from. Yeah. But also with the McCarthy era, was clearly also to call out the people who said they were acting within the law, but actually sort of, as you say, starting to persecute people because of their thinking. Yeah, yeah. I mean, certainly, when I reread Eichmann in Jerusalem for writing the book, I hadn't realized before that as much as Eichmann, who's not really very interesting after a while, she's really interested in the stories of people who disobey. She keeps on coming back every time someone comes up who said no. She says, how did that work? What courage did that take? And then she says somewhere, I think a bit later, best of us... But this was about people in the trial?
People who came up in the trial. So that, the soldiers who did not shoot, people who helped refugees, the Jews, Warsaw Ghetto resistors.
So who said no to being asked to commit crimes.
Yeah, who disobeyed. Yeah. Because it turned out you can always disobey. This is, and she said there's something, best of all will be those who know they can live with themselves, whatever happens. Which I think resonates across the century. But not only that, so it's not just a kind of liberal version of private conscience versus the big state. Why thinking was also so important to her was what she wanted is the ground of truth against what allows totalitarian thinking to work, which is a culture of lying and fiction. So she says very famously in Origins of Totalitarianism, the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist. It is the person who can no longer tell the difference between fiction and reality. That is the ideal subject of any kind of totalitarian rule. So when you have a kind of post-truth culture, when you have a culture pretty much as we have emerging in the States, which lies all the time, and everyone knows they're lying all the time. It's part of the contract.
Absolutely.
And that really matters because the only thing that keeps politics or keeps humanity sound is a sense of having the ground beneath our feet. She says at some point, lying has always been part of politics because politics is about making stories that people want to share. So you have to sort of test the narrative. But actually, when you lie to the point where the ground has been left, she says, truth is the earth on which we sit and the sky above. And I always think, she says that in her essay, Lying and Politics, and I always think of the climate catastrophe at that moment. It's when people start lying about climate science, which is not only, lying anti-science, it's lying in terms of, most of us have experienced or have experience of flooding, fires. It's absolutely happening in front of our noses, even if we didn't like scientists. Mm. And people are still lying about that. Then you really have to wonder why we're bothering carrying on.
But it's also, if you look at the new administration that Trump appoints now with climate deniers and COVID deniers and everything sort of being completely normalized. And in my political professional experience in the past 30 years as a reporter, I was in Pennsylvania in October focusing on Trump voters all over the country because it was the swing state. And I have to say, I was really shocked, because you talk to people who were completely, you know, friendly, nice, in different professions all over that state, and they were white, working class, and Latino, my immigrants, and everybody was sort of totally happy to talk to me. And they believed in the most absurd conspiracy theories that you can imagine, like that the Democrats had turned on a hurricane machine to weaken America. And I said, a hurricane machine? At the beginning I thought, like, okay, so this is some crazy person who slept badly or something. And then I understood there's a whole movement of hurricane machine believers. And then people were happy to be photographed in front of a sort of depiction of George Soros as the puppet player of the Joe Biden. And I said, but you understand that this is an anti-Semitic idea of world governments? And they said, like, no, but if you want the world governments, you need to control the president. Yeah. And I said, like, but what world governance? Yeah. I mean, I was sort of like, what? And this is normalized now. Yeah. You know, these people didn't feel that they were saying something outrageous. It was just me coming from Europe with this. And then you come home, and of course you realize a lot of people are here, like, believe these things in our countries too.
But one of the things she says, which I think is so important, is it's a mistake to think that people are just being stupid and gullible. As much as it might be nice for the people in this room who fully pride themselves on their education, think, how can you believe in a hurricane machine? Or the one I liked was the Jewish lasers causing forest fires in California, which I thought, wow, I'm capable of doing that, who knows? You know? But she says, at some point, she says, it's actually part of a cynicism as well. So she says the masses' belief in fiction is a protest against the reality in which they have to live.
Yeah.
I think it's such a key sentence for me for understanding what she was getting at. So there is a kind of, you know, it's almost like the death drive that's involved in that, and also a cynicism, because people will say, I know it's lies. I mean, that's probably, Trump does this all the time. He says, you know, he just lies. He's like Hitler, because Hitler was always saying things like, you know, we're winning bigly. Yeah. And then you look at the German papers will be saying, you know, National Socialists lost. And he said, we won. And you think, and Trump does exactly the same. And even when Trump doesn't lie, people don't believe him. When he says, I am the leader of a mass movement, he's behind you. So it works both ways. And she talks about, you know, it's cynicism. Mm. And that's why it goes back to when she talks about delusions of omnipotence. There's a sense of hubris here, that there are people who think they can do everything. Trump thinks he can do anything. The people around him think they can do anything. And to some extent, they're right. But it's also a delusion, because, you know, reality, thank God, is always going to intervene.
A little bit of a checker. But, you know, what Hannah Arendt, of course, didn't know is what social media will do also to the truth. You know, it's just that
I think she did. She said she went to, I mean, that's the other thing she said. It wasn't just nasty Europeans who had their totalitarianism. When she got to America, she said the other thing that's causing loneliness and deracination and world alienation is consumer capitalism, because it destroys the value of work and it destroys the value of democracy, because it's just run. So she saw that coming, but she also went to Stanford when the behavioural science unit was just set up in 1955, and of course she hated it. And she said, the thing I don't like about this new science of human behaviour is not that it's wrong, but that it might become true. Mm. Which is to say, it's not that the science is wrong, but the science might turn us into the that are being run. And in that case, I think she hated over-socialization of politics. She would have detested Twitter. She would have actually turned around and said, what, we told you about this? We told you about propaganda, and that was newspapers and radio. And you're doing this? You're letting them do this? And the other kind of old-fashioned thing you'd say is, these are kind of sovereign entities who are running social media throughout the West, at least, which are being unchecked.
Well, I mean, this is the situation we are in now, where Silicon Valley has turned into a pro-Trumpian era, where you know, a few very powerful billionaires are sort of influencing politics that hits us. Yeah? Yeah. So we're in a very tricky situation there. But having said all that, what Hannah Arendt took also from Kant was this sentence which I thought was fascinating, that there is no right to obey.
Yeah.
So it's sort of an imperative, in fact, to always check if you don't have to speak up against injustice or your own government, even if it's democratically elected.
Yeah, nobody has the right to obey. I think it's brilliant.
Yeah.
And it is about, that kind of thing that Kant taught. Well, he taught us several things, but he taught us a lot. But he taught us we're thinking beings. That's what grounds us. Kant also wanted to put things into metaphysics, but it's another story. But how we think has moral consequences for other people. It's that simple. And so if you want to protect things like political community, democracy, the Enlightenment, it has to begin with your willingness to disobey, as well as, he'll also say, if you're going to be in this community, you have to obey. You can't just sort of be a little destructive anarchist a la Elon Musk in the corner there. You have to kind of get with the project. But yeah, it is that. Nobody has the right to obey. It's not good enough to say, I couldn't do anything. They told me to do it. Mary McCarthy, who was the novelist who wrote The Group, and a very, very good friend of Arendt, and she described the kind of morality of Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil. She said the problem is, Arendt said, the problem with modern evil is it's lost the quality that people used to recognize evil by, which is to say temptation. You do something evil because you're being tempted to do something. This is like Milton, Goethe writes about this, we know about this. That's gone. It's like we don't know how to have a conversation about moral responsibility and evil. And Mary McCarthy says, when someone points a gun at your head and tells you to kill your neighbor, he is not ordering you, he's tempting you. And so both Arendt and McCarthy were saying we don't know how to talk about moral responsibility anymore in this new world. And we urgently need to find a new language to talk about moral responsibility.
One of the things which she's always criticized for was her reaction to Elizabeth Eckford, the young girl, school child, who insisted on going to the school where the black students were allowed in now, but where the society wasn't necessarily ready to receive them. And it's very difficult to understand when we think of everything we know about Hannah Arendt, that at that moment in 1957, she was not prepared to say, this is what I'm talking about. This is the disobedience, when it was even the law, of course, that this girl and the other black students should be able to go to that school. But because they were threatened by this group of white students who sort of abused them, she, I think, felt also scared for the safety of the children. But the fact that she didn't recognize that this was a very important act of disobedience is still today for me not quite understandable.
No,
is it to you?
No. I think there's a good argument here, which was, this is the Little Rock Nine. So the Little Rock Nine, schools throughout the South have been desegregated in this very famous case called Brown versus the state. I can't remember. I should look it up. It's in the book. And the segregationist South just didn't do it. They thought of all sorts of reasons for not desegregating schools, and they refused to do it. So this is where civil disobedience came in, which is like, we're going to make the law work. This is going to damn well happen. So the Little Rock Nine were a group of 9 black teenagers who exercised their right to an equal education by marching up the steps of the Arkansas State High School. Elizabeth Eckford didn't get the message, and she wasn't on the phone, that they were going to be escorted. So she ends up going by herself. She gets a bayonet put in front of her by the state troopers and has to do this walk back to the bus stop, where she's surrounded by white, not only white student racists, but white racist women. She spat, a woman spat in her face. She was threatened. And photographs of Elizabeth Eckford, you must have seen them. It's this young woman in sunglasses, chin held high, walking through this. And Arendt said, how the hell can you let your kids go through this? What are you doing? She was furious. And I think, a lot of people would say it reminded her of growing up in Königsberg and the anti-Semitic abuse that she had, every Jewish child had at that time. Education should have nothing to do with politics. And that's the bit where I think she's right. If you take politics into the classroom at your peril, there should not be ideology in education. Education should be somewhere that's aside from the state, that's doing something else. And what she could not see is that Eckford was actually performing her version of politics, which is courageously being seen and making the law work for what it works for. What she didn't like, what she was furious with liberal friends, was using education as a battle when there were still sort of laws against interracial marriage and interracial sex, and basic citizen rights laws, which were allowed to stand. So she thought education was an easy target. But then Ralph Ellison wrote a very famous essay where he takes her to task. And she writes to him and said, and he says, look, basically it's not an option for black people, they have to act. Mm. And that's the tragedy of black existence in a racist America, that you don't get to opt in or out, and all the kids know it. And she writes back to him, she says, I knew I was wrong, and I had missed that dimension of courage. So she does get it. I mean, she gets there in the end.
Yeah, I mean, we get this also from your book, that she eventually understands it for what it was, that especially because the civil disobedience that these children showed was civil, was non-violent. There were, other rights movements coming from the black community that were not necessarily non-violent. Yeah. So where you could have more of a debate. But that's also what brings us to today. If you think how people discuss today the protests of activists against climate change, which I always find astonishing, how much resistance or how much rejection there is of young people sitting, or also not only young people, but sitting down on streets and blocking the traffic, which is really inconvenient for people who need a car to get to their workplace and all these kind of things, and I understand it. But they are not sort of calling for violent resistance or a bloody revolution. They are sort of putting their own bodies into this fight. They are harming their own bodies if they glue themselves to the streets. And that should also be seen as something in the context from the suffragettes over the civil rights movement to today as something which is actually, in the name of progress, and also in that case, if saving the planet, a really important issue. Yeah. So I wonder why it's still not understood after all those years what Hannah Arendt has taught us.
Yeah. No, she talked quite a lot. I mean, she always talked, one of the things I respond to so well in her thought, that the world, we make the world, people make the world, and we do so through history. And that's a kind of, so great art, science, literature, our being, is what gets, what gets left behind. And ditto, the natural world. And she has, at the beginning of The Human Condition, which is a very underread book, partly because it's quite mad. It's a really strange book. But she opens that watching Sputnik, the first satellite, go around the world, and everyone's sort of looking up in the sky, waiting for Sputnik. And she's in New York, and she says what was so notable was a sense of one disappointment because the Americans really fed up because the Russians had got there first, so there wasn't a great kind of, if it had been America, it would have been, She said there's this moment of relief that you could now leave the Earth. And she said that was really distressing. What is going on here? Why is this good? I always think of Elon Musk again saying climate change is all right because we're going to colonize Mars. You think, have you not learned? Like one on the colonization project hasn't ended well. Two, what does it mean to want to leave the Earth? So she actually thinks we all have a responsibility to the world, which isn't just our immediate world. she didn't get there quite in the end, but I think she would come around to, we have responsibility for the, I mean, she talked about natural life as being plural in the same way as human life was, for protecting. So I think, I mean, towards the end of her life, it's very interesting, just backtrack a little bit. When she first published Bits of Eichmann in Jerusalem, it was in the New Yorker in '63. And William Shawn, the editor of the New Yorker, had a run of brilliance within 6 months around that time. He published in September of that year, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Rachel Carson was a marine biologist and a brilliant writer. And this book was uncovering the damage that pesticides were doing to American agriculture and to American life, and people were actually poisoning the land. And she did run a direct line between, you know, it was DDT, you know, give me spots on my apples, leave me the birds and the bees. That it was part of a war technology that was now destroying the planet. It's an absolutely brilliant book, and she wrote it while she was dying of breast cancer, which is another reason why it's an incredibly moving book. Then Shawn published James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, A Letter to a Region of My Mind, which was about American racism. And then he published Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem. All these three things, you know, the environment, the planet, racism, the banality of evil, were all published at the same time, 62, 63. And it's like, we didn't quite listen here at the same, and I think there's a reason why Rachel Carson, Hannah Arendt, and James Baldwin are three of the figures that are really resonant now. And towards the end of her life, she said that her hope was, in order to provide a political challenge to consumer culture and to the way she saw world alienation going, was, she said, and she said this in literally 75, showed the first springs of hope for an alternative politics to the one she, you know, the one she'd faced. Yeah. So I think she would have, what she wouldn't have liked would be attacks on art by climate change activists.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, no, she doesn't have to love all that. You know, nobody has to love all activism.
Exactly. No, I think because it's about preserving. I mean, Hannah Arendt is a conservationist. She's a small c radical conservative. I mean, her whole thing is like not making new things. It's like protect what's what's in front of your noses, and have a world you can respond to. Stop trying to make new things. Yeah. You know.
Also a very interesting question that she would have had a good time talking it through with Elon Musk, but also the climate activists are actually not out to destroy art pieces. Just throw soup on glass. But okay, so I've just seen that the time ran away with us. Are there any questions that people would like to ask?